One of the most tragic parts of the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the fate of her husbands. The executed Queen of Scotland would stumble into terrible relationships and marriages, but her first marriage ended in death and tragedy. King Francis II of France was the eldest son of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, and he reigned as the King of France from 1559 to 1560, and his life was very short. He suffered with his health in his final year of life, and it's considered that Francis II died on the 5th of December 1560 from an ear infection. Others have said he had a more sinister death, being possibly poisoned by his enemies. But following his death, he was buried inside the Basilica of St Denis. However, in the centuries following Francis II's death, his tomb and coffin would be broken into and smashed to pieces, and his remains were desecrated, and in the centuries after, it's been lost. But what was found when his coffin was opened? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. King Francis II of France was born on the 19th of January 1544 to King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. Francis was his eldest son, and it was expected from birth that he would one day become the King of France, and he was the heir, or Dauphin as they were known. For royals, having children was pivotal to ensure the family line continued, and Francis was prepared for kingship from a young age. He had a very royal upbringing, but it was clear early on that Francis was a sickly child, and he was not very well at all. As a young man, he suffered with stunted growth and failed to flourish into a strong teenager, but he also suffered with many breathing problems and respiratory issues, and he was throughout his whole life plagued with illness. He continued to be given a grand education and was tutored by foreign scholars, and he was taught different languages. He was also trained in fencing and dancing, and was not raised by his parents but by a governess. In 1546, Francis was appointed the governor of Languedoc, and he was then also made the Dauphin of France officially. However, one of the biggest events in the young prince's life was the fact he was betrothed and married to Mary, Queen of Scots, the young Scottish monarch who was also known as Mary Stuart. Francis, his father, negotiated the betrothal to Mary, and it was hoped that this would create an alliance between Scotland and France in the face of the English, and Francis was just 4 years old when the betrothal was signed and sealed. Mary had been crowned the Queen of Scotland since the age of 9 months, and she was also the niece of Claude, the Duke of Guise, an influential power player at the French court. At the age of 6, Mary was sent to France to be raised in court there until her marriage. The marriage occurred on the 24th of April 1558, as the 14-year-old Francis married the 15-year-old Mary, and they would remain married until Francis's death. Just over a year into the marriage, on the 10th of July 1559, Francis became King of France after his father died, after sustaining injuries in a jousting accident. Francis was 15 years old, and months later, on the 21st of September 1559, he was crowned king. The crown was so heavy for the weak boy that it had to be held in place by nobles, as he could not hold it. Following his coronation, the court moved to the Loire Valley, and Mary and Francis lived in a residence at the Château de Blois. Francis was just 15, but he was considered an adult and old enough to rule himself, and he did delegate power to Mary, Queen of Scots' uncle, the Duke of Guise. He took control of the military, and also the Cardinal of Lorraine was placed in charge of finances and diploma. Francis II's reign was short, but plagued by religious unrest. He was a Catholic, and he did not like those who were Protestant, and he enforced a repressive policy towards Protestantism in France, which later led to a conspiracy attempt, a coup against the king. The plan was for the king to be abducted, but luckily for Francis, the conspiracy failed and he lived on. But the Royal Council then sought to reconcile with Protestants to bring an end to persecutions and further conspiracy, and Francis had all religious prisoners released. But as part of his marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, France was joined to Scotland, and if one nation suffered, then the other would. Now, there was a secret clause in the marriage known as the crown matrimonial, which said that Scotland would become a part of France if Mary and Francis did not have children. Mary's mother acted as regent of Scotland, whilst Mary, Queen of Scots, lived in France, and the French control was not popular in Scotland, who wanted to rule themselves. Marie of Guise was later forced out of Edinburgh, but France took back control of Scotland, and France wanted to take control of Scotland. The Treaty of Edinburgh was signed. However, Francis would die at the age of 16. His health, as mentioned, had never been good, and on the 16th of November 1560 he fainted. After ruling for roughly 17 months, Francis II died on the 5th of December 1560 at Orleans, from which is considered an ear infection. Something which, although not the most serious, caused chaos with the sickly king's health. Others have suffused that he died from meningitis or some other condition, and the royal surgeon at the time even considered drilling a hole into the king's head to relieve pressure. Nevertheless, Francis II died, leaving his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, a young widow. Some suspected Protestants of poisoning the king, but this has not been proven. Francis II died childless, and his younger brother Charles succeeded him, with his mother, Catherine de' Medici, being made the regent of France. Mary went back to Scotland. However, the king's body was then being interred inside of the Basilica of St Denis. At the time, this was becoming a royal mausoleum, and Francis was buried inside of a large tomb in the nave. However, during the French Revolution, there was a ruthless and brutal attack upon the royal tombs inside of the Basilica of St Denis. The revolutionaries ordered a decree that they wanted to get rid of the corpses of the kings and queens who had ruled over them, and the French National Convention ordered the destruction of the royal tombs. The revolutionaries opened the coffins and tombs, and they also ransacked the visceral urns of former monarchs that contained hearts and other internal organs. Francis's body had been embalmed after death, and his heart was placed inside of a special box to be placed elsewhere. The crypts in 1790 were opened, and the bodies of the former royals were ripped out of their tombs and coffins, and they were subjected to a harrowing fate. The bodies were removed from the Basilica of St Denis and were then thrown in a pit and were treated terribly. On the 16th of October 1793, 21 coffins were broken into, and the remains of the former French monarchs were thrown unceremoniously into the pit, which had been covered in quicklime to decay and rot the corpses quicker. It was said by an eyewitness that most of the bodies were decaying. A foul-smelling, thick black vapour was released, which they desperately tried to dispel with vinegar and powder that had been taken with the precaution of burning, which did not prevent the workmen from feeling under and feverish, but without consequence. It's not known specifically when King Francis II's remains were ransacked and broken into, but it happened roughly around this time. His tomb was easy to get to and was an easy target for the revolutionaries, and his body was covered in quicklime outside in the pit to rot it quicker, and his remains were never recovered. The attack upon the remains of the boy king was a shocking consequence of the French Revolution, and it was one of the ways in which the revolutionaries tried to bring the whole concept of monarchy into shame and disrepute. But Francis II was a young boy king who reigned for just over a year, and he then succumbed to his health because of an ear infection. He would be buried inside of the royal mausoleum, but was not left there for eternity as was intended. And today the remains are still missing, presumably lying in the ground around the Basilica of St Denis. But because of the quicklime, there will be nothing left. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.